Hello, I'm Marlene Saeed. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, dampening down rising tensions, the US and China pledged to stabilise relations. But what's been the cost of their strained ties? Also this week, Kenya's president wants to reduce its massive public debt. But Kenyans hard hit by the rising cost of living are outraged by proposed tax increases. Plus, Japanese fishermen are worried about keeping their industry afloat more than 12 years after the Fukushima nuclear disaster. They've been fighting a trade war for years, but the economies of the US and China are deeply interdependent. And tensions between the world's two largest economies, which have caused relations to sink to a historic low, are now hurting businesses. During a rare meeting in Beijing, the US Secretary of State and China's president agreed on a need to stabilise relations. Mike Hanna reports from Washington, D.C.
Numerous US business leaders have visited China as it eases the pandemic travel restrictions. Apple's chief executive Tim Cook visited in March and lauded what he called his company's symbiotic relationship with China. Bill Gates was granted a meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping, another example of how US firms continue to eye the massive Chinese market despite the differences on a national level. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken became the highest-level US diplomat to visit China in 5 years, the clear intention to reset a relationship that has been broken, but also insisting that a full resumption of ties would not be unconditional.
I made clear that we'll continue to take targeted actions that are necessary to protect U.S. national security.
U.S. national security is an issue that has been brought up in Congress, a concern cited in the recent hearings concerning the Chinese-owned TikTok app.
What is shocking to me is the shared source code between TikTok in the United States and the CCP-centered Douyin.
Despite denials by its CEO that any data is shared with the Chinese government. But this is also an issue in China, where national security is regarded as the key pillar on which any economic relationship or development is based. And some observers contend the similarities between China and the US outweigh the differences.
Together we are better, but and we need each other. The United States really can't divorce itself from Chinese manufacturing or the Chinese market, and the same thing is true for China.
The US remains angered by a series of what it calls Chinese provocations, including a Chinese surveillance balloon in US airspace. The dispute now compounded by President Biden during a fundraiser in California. He said the Chinese president didn't know it was there, and that, he continued, was the great embarrassment for dictators. This certain to infuriate Beijing, already angered by what it considers unfair tariffs on many of its export items. The question amidst the dispute remains, what will the future relationship be based on? National pride or economic benefit? Mike Hanna for Counting the Cost, Washington.
Despite the geopolitical tensions, trade between the US and China hit a record high last year. Imports and exports between the two countries reached more than $690 billion. The previous record in bilateral trade was close to $660 billion in 2018. Back then, former President Donald Trump imposed tariffs on more than $300 billion worth of Chinese goods. China then responded by placing import levies on nearly $100 billion of American goods. President Joe Biden stepped up the trade war with Beijing in October of 2022. He imposed sweeping restrictions aimed at limiting China's access to semiconductors and technology critical to its military power. To discuss all of this, I'm joined now by Greg Swenson. He is the founding partner at merchant bank Brigg McAdam. Thank you for joining the programme. Greg, to what extent did economics motivate this meeting between these two superpowers recently?
Well, I'm afraid not enough. It was surely, part of the conversation, but I think that the Secretary of State Blinken, as well as the entire administration, have missed an opportunity to elevate economics to the top. Now, that's not to say there wasn't some pressure from corporate America and some real interest from corporate America to, have the talks and reach some sort of agreement on how to proceed with Chinese-U.S. trade, which is vital to both countries. But I don't think they really took advantage of the opportunity.
And do U.S. companies still regard China as the #1 place to invest, as it once used to do?
I don't think so. I think that they realize, especially after the supply chain crisis and COVID, with the potential dependency on China for pharmaceuticals and other key inputs, I think there's some real concern about being too dependent on that supply chain. So you'll see, and I hope that they work together, work with our allies, the U.S. allies, on trade agreements, so to reduce that dependency on China and diversify. That doesn't mean that the country wants to shut down trade, and I think it's still a hugely important market. And I think that many of these companies want to make sure that that market is still available. But I don't think it will be a destination for foreign direct investment and the kind of investment that you've seen in the last 3 decades. I don't think you'll see that, and I think there's going to be a little bit more caution and potentially onshoring, but more importantly, just diversifying the supply chains.
And what about Chinese businesses? How do they see the U.S. market?
Well, it's really important to the Chinese businesses to have access to that market. And I think that there should be, I wish that economics and trade were put at the top of the list for these talks, because it is important to the Chinese. It's perhaps more important to the Chinese than it is to the U.S. And so, but it just has to be done with some limits. And I think, Mike Gallagher, who's the chairman of the Congressional Committee on the CCP, has made some really good points about, let's keep the trade going, but with some restrictions on key inputs and key exports, as well as restrictions on investing in anything to do with the Chinese military complex.
We've had some big business titans from the U.S., like Bill Gates, the CEO of Tesla, JP Morgan, Apple, all making recent trips to China. What is that all about? Are they at odds with how the U.S. government sees things?
Potentially, but I don't think so. In fact, if you looked at Jake Sullivan's speech a few weeks ago, he almost is tilting or trying to tilt the administration toward the kind of state capitalism that you'd learn in the Chinese economy, where the state has such a major role in the economy. So I think that the corporations and the CEOs that have visited probably are doing it with the blessing of the administration, and because they like that kind of model, and the huge corporates, the state-backed corporates. So in many ways they're probably on the same page as the administration. I'm not sure they're on the same page or consistent with American interests. But I think for some self-interest for these big companies, it makes sense. And you also have the, Bill Gates' ties to the WHO, which shouldn't be ignored. He's a big supporter of the WHO, and the Chinese have all but taken over the WHO. And now you've had the recent entry by the North Koreans. So, these are things that are often overlooked on these visits, but I think it's important to point that out.
When we look at the U.S. export controls on semiconductor chips to China, I mean, how badly has that hurt China? And do you see any sort of relaxing on any of these controls in the near future?
Yeah, I do see some compromise. That's potential compromise, but it has to be done from a position of strength, and I think that's been the flaw with the administration in the last 2 years. They're constantly afraid of provoking Xi and again slow walking a lot of these changes to the trade and that are important for national security and for both economic security as well as national security. So as long as those targets can be reached, then I think there is room for some loosening of some restrictions. But again, with the product dumping, the IP theft, the illegal subsidies, the really economic coercion that the Chinese have implemented on the U.S., but also on South Korea, on Australia, on Japan, I think that there has to be some agreements that are made to stop that economic coercion, and then we get back to free and fair trade.
For China, economic growth has come above all else for a very, very long time. Do you think that is still the case now?
I think it has to be, and I think that's the one thing that Xi is afraid of. He's got to somehow continue this growth, and that's why he's increased the stimulus recently because, he's afraid. I mean, you have 500 million people living on a few dollars a day in China. And what they've been able to do in the last few decades is continue growth, create jobs every year. So there is a growing middle class, but you still have 500 million people living in poverty. And you also have a massive demographic problem coming with the aging of the population. I know that's very well known, but I think he's going to need to focus on growth. Whether he does that correctly or not, I'm not sure. And I think you have to also consider that they're going to face some headwinds, not only from the aging of the population, the demographics, but they have a real natural resource problem. And I think that should be addressed as well in any trade negotiations. And we should do that from a position of strength. They're 20% of the world population, but they only have 7% of the world's fresh water. They also have a big problem with energy, and you've seen that in the last few years, importing oil from the Russians, for example. So, these are some issues that I think Xi cannot ignore, and that's why he needs economic growth.
Absolutely fantastic to get your analysis. Greg Swenson, founding partner at merchant bank Brigg McAdam. Thank you so much, sir.
Good to be here. Thanks again.
A public debt mountain, currency depreciation, and the worst drought in 4 decades. Kenya's economy is being hit hard. President William Ruto is pushing through a controversial finance bill aimed at repairing the damage, which includes tax increases. But many Kenyans say they are already struggling to make ends meet. Victoria Gatenby has a story.
Kenya's finance minister called it a budget of short-term pain for long-term gain. Its policies are intended to reduce the country's $70 billion deficit. That's nearly 70% of gross domestic product. But tax increases during a cost of living crisis are unpopular, and more than a dozen opposition members of parliament walked out as Njuguna Ndungu began his speech.
And to the people of Kenya,
among the measures announced was a doubling of value-added tax on fuel from 8% to 16%.
The extra taxes will not just affect employed people. Self-employed people will be squeezed as well. I feel as if we're going to be forced to pay tax.
There are also plans to increase income tax by 5% for those earning more than $5,000 a month, and proposals for a mandatory contribution to an affordable housing fund. 3% will be deducted from an employee's salary and matched by the employer. Small business owners say it's a disaster.
Right now we have looked at how many staff we have, and we think that we may have to go between 10 to 15% of the staff we're going to go down. So that's about 20 staff, and that's a huge, huge impact.
Some Kenyans have been protesting against the plans outside Parliament. The demonstrations are often broken up by police. Kenya's economic growth slowed to nearly 5% last year from nearly 8% the previous year. Incomes haven't kept up with rising prices. Many Kenyans say they can't afford tax hikes.
Prices of basic commodities like sugar have really spiked. Many people sleep hungry in their homes because life has become unbearable.
President William Ruto's administration wants about $25 billion to fund its budget and balance its finances. But for many Kenyans, taking away money from their already low pay means more suffering and perhaps job losses. Victoria Gatenby for Counting the Cost.
Joining me now from Oxford in the UK is Reginald Kazutu, a Chief Executive Officer at Nairobi-based Amana Capital. He's also an Associate Lecturer at Oxford Brookes Business University. Many thanks for joining the programme. So the government is raising taxes on a lot of basic items, things like food, fuel, mobile money transfers, beauty products, digital content, all of which are going to hit the ordinary Kenyan. You can see why they're so upset.
Yes, definitely. But I think the Kenyan population should have seen this coming. For the last 10 years, the Kenyan government has been on a binge on increasing debt, which increased from about 1 trillion to close to 10 trillion Kenya shillings by the time the previous regime was finishing. That increased the debt servicing cost from a low of 20% of revenue to close to now 70% of revenue as we speak. and that debt servicing has to be financed through taxes. So the Kenyan population should have seen that taxes are going to rise. How they've done them, though, then seems to be another ballgame altogether, because it's a convolution of taxes, as you have mentioned, on areas where you would not expect taxes to be hit on a very low income country like Kenya.
As you say, the issue seems to be not so much that they're putting up taxes, it's where they're putting the taxes. And we've heard from the Kenyan President, William Ruto, who says the country has to make short-term sacrifices for them to achieve in the long term. I understand that, but was this the best way?
I don't think it was the best way. There's always this fallacy with governments that if you increase taxes, you collect more taxes without looking at the contra effect that comes by raising taxes. So, for example, they've raised the VAT on fuel from 8% to 16%, which is going to make the price per liter of fuel more expensive. The ripple effects of that is that transport costs will go up. If transport costs go up, food costs go up. If food costs go up, disposable income reduces. If disposable income reduces, aggregate demand in the economy reduces. The economy does not do well, and means that you will end up actually collecting less taxes. So I think they should have found ways of raising revenue without directly affecting the disposable income of the low-income workers. And I think the problem the president is having is he campaigned on a platform of reducing taxes. In less than 6 months in power, he has done the complete opposite of what he promised people. So in that case, that's deceit.
And it seems like a good point to ask you. I mean, how did the Kenyan government get so heavily indebted in the first place? I mean, you get lots of countries who operate within a system where they are in debt. Why is Kenyan such a problem?
Number one, fixing symptoms and not fixing the real problem. So, for example, they built an expressway because of traffic congestion, and they wanted to deal with traffic in Nairobi. But that was dealing with a symptom and not dealing with a real problem. And the real problem was a dead rural economy, which increased migration from rural areas to urban areas. So instead of focusing resources on how do we grow the agricultural sector to ensure that the rural economy is thriving, to stop people from moving to urban centers and urbanizing those rural areas, they will have sorted out that problem with little money. They built a railway, again, and a huge infrastructure project which had no impact on the economy. So there's been a lot of borrowing for projects that have not generated either an increase in export revenue or an increase in incomes. So you end up with ghost projects, or you end up with projects that have no value in terms of income generation, which now helps them to collect more taxes in the future. And I think that's the problem that they had. And from this finance bill, it looks like they're continuing with the exact same script going forward.
And the worry is, what impact is this going to have long-term, presumably? I mean, we had a warning from the World Bank earlier this year about these very tax increases, saying that they would end up slowing down economic activity and growth. Is that something you're concerned about?
It will definitely slow down economic growth because majority of the people in Kenya are not savers, they are spenders. That means they live paycheck to paycheck. So if you reduce their disposable income because you have increased the cost of food, you have increased the cost of transportation, electricity, the cost of housing, you find people don't have much money to spend on other areas. What that will happen, it means productivity is going to reduce, supply is going to reduce, people are going to get laid off, especially with the additional taxes on corporates. The corporates have to match housing levy, an additional 1.5, which they not plan for. National Health Fund has increased, and National Social Security Fund has also increased. So the cost for the employer has also increased. So the employer now is asked themselves, do I employ an extra additional person or do I cut down so that I'm able to fund my operations? So there are taxes that were put without looking at the impact, the larger impact on the economy. Therefore, in the next 1 year or 2 years, you'll find they will still be in the same situation where they are short of revenue, their debt servicing cost continues to go up, and the economy wobbles into a recession that they might not be able to come out of.
What fantastic analysis. Thank you so much for your time. Reginald Kazutu, Chief Executive Officer at Nairobi-based Amana Capital, also Associate Lecturer at Oxford Brookes Business University, speaking to us there from Oxford. As a fellow Kenyan, I say asante sana.
Thank you.
Fukushima fishermen have struggled to sell their fish for years after the 2011 nuclear disaster for fears of radioactive contamination. More than 12 years after the incident took place, the industry is now facing a new threat. Japan plans to release tons of treated wastewater into the sea. Fishing communities say consumers could shun their catch once again and send prices down. Neighbouring countries, including South Korea, China and the Pacific Island nations, also oppose the plan. South Korean imports of Japanese seafood sank more than 30% last month. The nation still bans fish imports from the area around the Fukushima nuclear plant. The Japanese government has set up a fund to promote the region's seafood and provide compensation for any loss in sales. To discuss all of this, I'm joined now from Shizuoka in Japan by Sajiro Takashita, Professor at the School of Management and Informatics at the University of Shizuoka. Thank you so much for joining the programme. How is the Japanese fishing industry coping more than 12 years on from the Fukushima disaster?
Overall, there's a macro environment that's really against them. First of all, the number of fishermen in Japan has dropped from 390,000 in 1988 to less than 150,000, of which 40% are over the age of 65. So even though we have a wonderful environment, such as Japan's seawater and also territorial areas, if you include exclusive economic zone, we have the 6th largest, seawater area. So we are very much abundant and very fortunate in our environment. But unfortunately, the personnel who's working in the fishery industry has dropped significantly. And for that reason, the fishery industry itself has shown a very big decline over the years.
Would you eat fish from the area?
Absolutely. There's absolutely no danger to it. It's been administered by International Atomic Energy Agency just this April, reconfirming that it is very safe. And in addition, the tritium, which is becoming the problem of this whole argument, the Fukushima is basically dealing with 1/7, watering it down to 1/7 of a recommended amount by WHO. So it is very safe. And let's not forget, this substance called tritium is being, thrown out in France, Korea, China, anywhere that has any nuclear, generator. So I'm not saying 2 or 3 or 4 wrongs make a right, but certainly it is well under the recommended, amount that's administered by WHO as well.
You're referring to the treated wastewater that is going to be released into the sea. Whether it is dangerous or not, there is still a perception, isn't there? How is it likely to affect demand?
Well, let's face it, France, annually they throw down approximately 1,500 terabecquerel. Korea, about 150, China also above 70. And this Fukushima plant is only 22 per annum over the span of 30 years. So, there shouldn't be a problem from a scientific point of view. But why is it a problem? Why am I talking to you right now in this interview? Because it's not to do with science nor common sense. It's a lot more to do with politics.
There is this government fund that's been set up to compensate fishermen for any losses that they might face. Is it a good fund? Does it go far enough?
However you compensate, as I just told you before, the actual number of fishermen is declining. The younger generations aren't willing to get into this industry, which is a very big problem. The fishery has dropped from 12.8 million tons in 1984 to only 4.4 in 2018. So this is a drastic decline. And the consumption, per capita consumption by the Japanese has also declined from the peak of 40 kilograms per person in 2001 to only 23. So what we're seeing is a decline of the consumption of fish itself. in spite of the fact that, we still remain to be one of the largest fish consumer. So there is a very serious, I would say, situation or environment that is hindering, the fishing industry in Japan as a whole.
Really interesting to talk to you. Sajiro Takashita, professor at the School of Management Informatics at the University of Shizuoka. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us by tweeting me at Marlene Saeed. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or, of course, you can drop us an email. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. It will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Marlene Saeed from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.